Hi, I'm Sherlock. Welcome to my new mystery case.
In those days when the fog lay over London like a pall, and the hansoms stole through it with the furtive caution of cats, Dr. Watson had resumed something of his former habit of dropping in upon Baker Street of a morning. He had his practice, to be sure, and a contented domestic hearth to which he was devoted, but there were hours when the worn carpet, the mantel-shelf with its chemical paraphernalia, and the gaunt, aquiline profile of his friend, bent over the Persian slipper, had a fascination no other place could supply. He found Holmes, as he had so often found him, stretched at length upon the settee, pipe within easy reach, his eyes half closed, and his thoughts, if one might judge by the stillness of his thin, expressive hands, gathered like a taut cord upon some silent problem. The air was keenly cold and carried the pleasant tang of coffee. He had scarcely set down his hat when Holmes spoke without turning his head. "I perceive that Mrs. Turner has returned to Bournemouth, and that your errand has nothing to do with consultation, but rather with reclamation." Watson laughed despite himself, for there was the old comfortable sting in the thrust. "You have not, at least, mislaid your talent in the fog," said he. "But if you would condescend to explain why Bournemouth and what I have come to reclaim, you would spare me a broken head in attempting to follow you." Holmes's eyelids rose languidly. "My dear fellow, if you will insist upon wearing your old ulster on a morning like this, you must expect the lint to take its revenge upon you. Observe the pale blue thread upon your sleeve. That particular hue I have seen only upon the sewing-room tapes of your Bournemouth aunt by marriage, Mrs. Turner, who is reluctantly in funds and supplies your good lady from time to time with mending silks. Reluctantly, I say, because this strand was torn by a hasty hand. By your right cuff is a minute granule of sealing wax, claret-coloured, with no fleck of gold. You have been to the post office, and later to a place where the remaining fragments of a bundle of letters were to be recaptured, reclamation. As for your errand not being medical, your gloves are in your pocket instead of your hat, which you adopt when you go out to patients, that you may be unencumbered. You would not carry files in such weather, in a coat not buttoned to the chin." He smiled that thin smile which never failed to stir Watson's admiration. It was upon his lips still when a rapping, brusque yet deferential, came at the door, and a moment later Mrs. Hudson's anxious face preceded the more official cast of Inspector Lestrade into the room. The inspector was gloved to the elbow and had the overdriven air of a coachman whose horse had bolted, but whose obligations compelled him to give chase none the less. His keen little eyes shot from Watson to Holmes. "Morning to you, Mr. Holmes," said he, and his tone, though guarded, had the note of appeal that was as familiar to Watson as the faded carpet. "I had not meant to disturb you at this ungodly hour, but I confess I have met with a case which refuses to be driven to kennel, and I would be more than mortal if I did not bring it to the one man who has a way with such brutes." Holmes waved him to the chair with a long-fingered hand. "Pray take it in order, Inspector. You have the look of a man who has swallowed his news whole and choked upon it." Lestrade unbuttoned his coat and drew out a notebook. "It's Arundel Street off the Strand, Mr. Holmes. You will know the place. Mr. Percival Quinton, a moneylender of no small fortune, Quinton of the Keys they call him, was found dead in his office this morning. As neat a place of business as you could wish, mahogany desk, Turkey carpet, and a fire unlighted in the grate, for he was close with coals as with shillings. His clerk, a poor, frightened creature by the name of Barnes, comes to open at 7:30. He finds the door made fast within, and no answer to his knock. There is a fanlight over the door, but nobody stirring within. He fetches a constable and sends for me. I was there by 8, We forced the door. Mr. Quinton was seated in his chair, his head thrown back a trifle, as if he had fallen asleep in looking at the ceiling. The key was in his pocket. The window behind him was latched. The safe stood closed, and so far as we can tell, nothing disturbed. There is no sign of violence. And yet the man is dead. Holmes had not stirred, but the pupils of his eyes contracted, a sure sign with him that his mind had leapt in a single bound to the heart of some novelty. "And yet you are not here for a natural death," he murmured. "No, sir," said Lestrade, and he swallowed once with a grimace that was almost comic in its embarrassment. "You see, Mr. Holmes, it was the doctor who brought you into it, as it were. We sent at once for Dr. Manley of the Adelphi, who lives but 3 streets off. He examined Mr. Quinton and made it plain enough that life was extinct. He would have put the time at a matter of an hour, maybe less, for, this is the devil of it, he declares the man's hands were still warm to the touch." Watson could not restrain an exclamation. "Warm, while the rest was cold?" "Cold as charity, sir," returned Lestrade with a sour twitch of the lips, face somewhat discoloured, jaw falling, the limbs beginning to stiffen. "I am no physician, but I have seen enough of sudden deaths to know a common thing when I see it. This is uncommon. The pulse was gone, the heart had stopped, and yet when I myself touched his hands, they were, this is no fancy, warm, like a man who has been sitting for a spell over a good coal fire. And look you, Mr. Holmes, we have no good fire to account for it. The office stove has not been lit these 2 days by the look of the ash." Holmes sat up with a supple spring and swung his legs to the floor. "Warm hands and a cold body," said he, half to himself. "No violence, a fastened room, and a man whose business throws around him a cloud of rancours and obligations such as a fly-paper collects. You find yourself spoilt for suspects, and yet without a suspect, Inspector. Is that the Colonel?" "Upon my life, it might be," Lestrade admitted. "We have the usual crop, of course. There was Mr. Fitzjohn, a gentleman with a cavalry moustache and a temper to match it, who had words with Mr. Quinton yesterday afternoon about a bill of sale that would take the very roof from his wife and babies, so he says. There is a clerk, young Barnes, who trembles if you look at him, and who would sell his own grandmother for 2 guineas if he thought you meant to rob him of it. There is the partner. Yes, partner, though his name is not on the door. Mr. Julius Price, sly as a stoat and twice as plump, who says he left at 6 and knows nothing of anything after. There is even a woman in it, Mr. Holmes, if that is any inducement. A lady's card upon the desk, the corner torn as if in haste, with nothing upon it but the name Miss V. Ainsley written in a hand like a steel nib held too hard. Holmes knitted his fingers and regarded the ceiling in turn, his lids drooping. "And the hour?" "That is part of my vexation. Barnes swears he left Mr. Quinton at 9 last night in fair health. The constable on Arundel Street says he saw a light in the office as late as 10:30. Mr. Price, the partner, says he took his hat at 5:45 and left Mr. Quinton in his usual spirits. Dr. Manley, as I say, places death within an hour before we forced the door. If so, then one or another of those has a better alibi than the Queen." Watson, whose mind had already leapt to his own store of observations on the subject of death and its supposed tokens, could not help but put a question. "You are certain the hands were warm when you entered, Inspector? It was not an impression born of contrast?" Lestrade turned his stiff hat between his palms. "Mr. Holmes will tell you that I am not a fanciful man, Doctor. I touched them myself. They were warm then and again 10 minutes later, when Dr. Manley had done his first look and was fetching his bag. By the time we had the ambulance brought round, they seemed less so, but you could not call them cold." Holmes rose in his quick, noiseless fashion. The languor was gone, the keen, eager face alive with that energy which Watson recognized as the awakening of some inner furnace of his nature. He crossed to the mantel and laid aside the remains of his pipe as a soldier sets down a toy. He glanced once at the window, where the fog pressed like a moist hand upon the pane. "Your coat, Watson," said he. "We shall go to Arundel Street. There is something in this trifling warmth, which, properly viewed, may prove to be no trifle. I shall leave it to you, Inspector, to keep the vultures from the carcass until we have taken a look, a single heavy foot, upon an unnoticed ash, and we shall be the poorer." Lestrade looked relieved, in a manner he did not trouble to disguise. "You will come now, then?" "Now," said Holmes. He had taken up the magnifying lens he favoured upon such occasions, and the little tape he was apt to carry as a man carries a snuff-box. As he did so, he paused, sniffed the air with a curiously delicate attention, and smiled a fraction. "You came by way of the Embankment, Inspector," he observed. "There is a briny suggestion under the fog." Lestrade's jaw fell a quarter of an inch. "I did indeed, Mr. Holmes," he confessed. "The Strand was a tangle, but how—" "Another time," said Holmes, and he was already at the door. "We go to a gentleman who might, if he had had the kindness to die in a less original manner, have spared you the trouble of climbing my stairs. As it is, you have brought me a morning's work, for which receive my thanks." Watson, who had known his friend to pass in a breath from the prone to the pantherine, found his own pulse enlarge to the accustomed rhythm. Yet even in that moment the singular phrase rang in his ear, with its unwholesome, piquant invitation, "a corpse with warm hands." He could not, with all his knowledge of the signs and seasons of death, reconcile the two. There was, in that modest departure from the expected, a promise of one of those intricacies upon which Holmes throve, as the gladiator upon the circle and the sword. As they descended to the street, the fog received them, and the rattle of wheels and the muffled cry of a costermonger came up like voices on the other side of a veil. In less than 10 minutes they were swallowed by it, and Baker Street behind them was no more substantial than a name. The hansom that carried them through the fog-shrouded streets moved with the deliberate caution of a vessel navigating treacherous waters. The familiar landmarks of London had been swallowed by the grey curtain that pressed against their windows, transforming the bustling metropolis into a muffled, spectral realm where only the clip of hooves and the distant cry of vendors penetrated the silence. Holmes sat forward, his aquiline profile cutting sharply through the dim interior, while his fingers drummed a restless tattoo against his knee, a sure sign that his mind was already racing ahead to possibilities that had not yet occurred to the official investigators. "You are contemplating the peculiar democracy of death, are you not, Holmes?" Watson ventured, as their cab lurched slightly around an omnibus that materialized suddenly from the grey void. Holmes's thin smile flickered in the uncertain light. "Indeed, my dear fellow, death treats all men with perfect equality, yet even death, it seems, may be persuaded to show favoritism in small matters. A corpse with warm hands suggests either a very recent departure from life or a very unusual one." He paused, drawing in a deep breath through his aquiline nose with that peculiar delicacy Watson had observed countless times. There is something in the very air of this case, Watson, a suggestion of artifice that clings to it like the fog to these streets. Arundel Street, when they finally reached it, proved to be one of those narrow thoroughfares that seem to exist in perpetual twilight. The fog here hung with almost deliberate malevolence, wrapping itself around the iron railings and brick facades. A constable stood guard at number 47, his cape beaded with moisture, straightening visibly at the sight of Lestrade, and touching his helmet with respectful recognition of Holmes. "Nothing disturbed, Constable Morrison?" Lestrade inquired, producing a key from his waistcoat. "Not so much as a sparrow's footprint, sir," came the reply, "though I'll say the fog has made it a lonely watch." The building possessed that peculiar mustiness common to places where money changed hands. Old leather, ink, and something else Watson could never quite identify, but had come to associate with financial desperation. Their footsteps echoed hollowly on the worn wooden stairs as they ascended to Quinton's office, where fresh splinters around the jamb told the story of forced entry. "The door was locked from the inside," Lestrade explained as he turned the key. "We had to break the bolt to get in." The office that greeted them was a study in methodical prosperity. The mahogany desk dominated the room beneath a large window overlooking the fog-shrouded alley, while a turkey carpet, worn but clean, deadened their footsteps. Against one wall stood a formidable iron safe, and in the cold grate lay, undisturbed, grey ash. But it was the chair behind the desk that drew their immediate attention, positioned at a slight angle, as if its occupant had been turning to look at something when death claimed him. Holmes moved with the fluid grace of a stalking cat, his keen eyes absorbing every detail. He did not immediately approach where the body had been found, but began instead a methodical circuit of the room's periphery. At the window he examined the latch with intense scrutiny, then moved to the door, his magnifying glass flashing as he studied the inner fastenings. "Dust upon the window runner is unbroken at the edges," he murmured, "disturbed only in the centre, consistent with ordinary use." He knelt at the threshold, his lens dwelling upon the brass escutcheon. With a pin from his sleeve, he extracted a hair's breadth of black thread from the crack between metal and wood, placing it carefully in his pocket-book. Watson, meanwhile, approached the desk with growing fascination. The blotter bore a visiting card, Miss V. Ainsley, in small, uncompromising script, its upper right corner torn away sharply. Beside it lay a steel pen, its nib washed bright, and a smear where a sleeve might have crossed wet ink. But it was the faint warmth that still emanated from where Quinton's hands had rested that truly confounded him. Despite his medical training, despite years of experience with death's cold certainty, this lingering heat defied all anatomical knowledge. Holmes had moved to the cold grate, where he spent several minutes examining the ash with microscopic attention. His gloved finger traced the mantelpiece, then paused at a speck near the desk rail, something like a minuscule coal beside the faintest crescent of brown upon the carpet's pile, as if something warm had briefly kissed the wool. From beneath the desk, his hand emerged with a crumpled scrap of perforated tin, no larger than a coin, its edge bent back. "Interesting," Holmes murmured, studying the fragment before slipping it into his book alongside the thread. Watson observed the position of this inkwell, precisely centered on the blotter, yet there, a drop of dried ink near the edge. "Someone has moved it, and recently." Lestrade stepped closer, his brow furrowed. "You think someone was here after Quinton died?" Holmes straightened to his full height, his grey eyes gleaming with that inner fire Watson knew so well. "I think, Inspector, that we are looking at a scene that has been very carefully arranged. The question is whether it was arranged by the victim or by his killer." The silence that followed was broken only by the distant sound of wheels upon cobbles, muffled by the fog that pressed against the windows like a living thing, as if London itself were holding its breath, waiting for the truth to emerge from this puzzle of warm hands and cold death. Holmes approached the leather chair with the deliberate care of a surgeon examining a wound, his long fingers tracing the worn armrests where countless anxious borrowers had gripped them in supplication. The morning light filtered through the fog-laden window, cast strange shadows across the mahogany desk, and Watson observed his friend's nostrils flare slightly, that telltale sign of a scent caught and catalogued. "The chair has been moved," Holmes announced quietly, kneeling to examine the carpet beneath. "See here, Watson. The indentations in the pile suggest its usual position was some 6 inches further from the desk. Yet a man of Quinton's bulk, seated for any length of time, would have left deeper impressions." He rose and pressed his palm against the leather back. "Still faintly warm, though that may be the morning sun through the glass." Lestrade shifted impatiently. "What does it signify, Mr. Holmes?" "Patience, Inspector. The chair tells us that either Quinton moved it himself in his final moments, or someone else arranged it after his death." Holmes moved to the desk's edge, his magnifying glass catching the light as he examined a series of minute marks along the polished wood. "Observe these scratches, fresh, made by something metallic being dragged across the surface. And here," he indicated a barely visible stain near the blotter's edge, "a residue, brownish yellow, with the faintest suggestion of char." Watson leaned closer, his medical training compelling him to study the evidence with scientific interest. "Could it be from a chemical reaction of some sort?" "Precisely what I was thinking, my dear fellow." Holmes straightened and turned toward the door. "Inspector, might we have a word with young Barnes? I believe he may illuminate some of these peculiarities." Lestrade summoned the clerk, who appeared in the doorway with the nervous energy of a sparrow sensing a cat nearby. His pale hands twisted his hat brim as he stepped into the office, his eyes darting from the desk to the window as if expecting Quinton's ghost to materialize. "Mr. Barnes," Holmes began in his most reassuring tone, "you mentioned Miss Ainsley yesterday. Pray tell us more about her visit." Barnes swallowed visibly. "She arrived near 7 o'clock, sir, fashionably dressed, though she wore a heavy veil, gave me her card and asked to see Mr. Quinton on urgent business. He saw her immediately, which was unusual. He rarely received callers without appointment." "How long did she remain?" "Perhaps 10 minutes, no more." "When she left, Mr. Quinton seemed agitated. He paced about, muttering to himself, then sent me to fetch Ledger C from the cellar. Heavy thing it is, sir, and the stairs are treacherous in the dim light. When I returned, she was gone, but I noticed the torn corner of her card upon the desk." Holmes nodded thoughtfully. "And after Miss Ainsley's departure, were there other visitors?" "Mr. Price came by at 5:30, as was his custom. He and Mr. Quinton spoke privately for some minutes. I noticed Mr. Price seemed to have misplaced something, kept patting his pockets as if searching. He asked if I'd seen his pocket warmer, a small tin device with holes punched in it. Said his fingers grew numb without it." Watson saw Holmes's eyes sharpen with interest. "A pocket warmer, you say?" "Yes, sir. Japanned tin, about the size of a sovereign. Mr. Price fills it with glowing charcoal to keep his hands warm during the cold months. He's quite particular about it. Says he brought the design back from his travels in Germany." "And did you locate this device?" Barnes shook his head. "No, sir. Mr. Price seemed quite put out about it. He searched his usual chair, even looked under the desk, but found nothing. He left shortly after, saying he'd return this morning to continue looking." Holmes exchanged a meaningful glance with Watson. "One final question, Mr. Barnes. After you departed at 9 o'clock, did you observe anyone entering the building?" The clerk's brow furrowed in concentration. "Now that you mention it, sir, I did see a gentleman approaching as I reached the corner. Tall fellow in a dark overcoat, walking with purpose toward our building. I thought nothing of it at the time. Mr. Quinton often conducted business after hours with his more discreet clientele." Could you describe this gentleman more precisely? Not clearly, sir. The fog was thickening, and the gaslight was poor. But he carried himself like a man of breeding, and I noticed he wore fine gloves, the sort that cost more than I earn in a month. Holmes stood motionless for a long moment, his grey eyes fixed upon some invisible point beyond the window. When he finally spoke, his voice carried that note of quiet satisfaction Watson had learned to recognize as the herald of revelation. "Thank you, Mr. Barnes. You have been most helpful." As the clerk departed, Holmes turned to his companions. "Gentlemen, we begin to see the outline of our puzzle. A pocket warmer mysteriously vanished, a chair repositioned, and a late visitor whose identity remains shrouded in mystery. The warm hands that so puzzled Dr. Manley may not be supernatural after all, but the product of very human ingenuity. The fog pressed against the windows like a living thing, and somewhere in its grey depths, Watson sensed, lay the key to understanding how a dead man's hands could retain the warmth of life. Holmes stood motionless for a long moment, his grey eyes fixed upon the crumpled fragment of perforated tin in his palm. When he spoke, his voice carried that note of quiet certainty that Watson had learned to recognize as the herald of revelation. "The warm hands that so perplexed Dr. Manley begin to yield their secret," he murmured, moving to the desk's edge where the faint brown stain marked the polished wood. "Observe this residue, Watson, the fine resinous soot of charcoal burned in a confined space, not from the grate, which has remained cold these 2 days, but from a more portable source." He held up the twisted metal fragment. A pocket warmer designed to hold glowing embers and radiate heat for hours. Placed strategically upon the deceased's hands, it would maintain their warmth long after the heart had ceased to beat. Lestrade's face bore the expression of a man wrestling with concepts that refused to yield to conventional police logic. "You would have us believe someone brought a brazier into a locked room, Mr. Holmes. A pretty trick for a corpse to manage." "The locked room, Inspector, presents less mystery than you might suppose." Holmes moved to the door, his long fingers tracing the brass escutcheon with delicate precision. From the crack between metal and wood, he extracted a hair's breadth of black thread, examining it through his magnifying glass. Silk, such as a gentleman might use to tie about a walking stick. Threaded through the keyhole and around the bolt, it would serve as well to secure a lock from the outside as any key from within. A simple tug would withdraw the evidence, leaving us to marvel at an impossible crime. Watson leaned closer to examine the thread. "But surely the positioning would require considerable skill." "Indeed, my dear fellow, our perpetrator possesses both ingenuity and familiarity with the premises." Holmes moved to the blotter upon the desk, his keen eyes studying its surface. "But let us pursue another avenue of inquiry." He withdrew a clean sheet of paper from the drawer and passed a soft pencil lightly across its surface. The gentle shading revealed the ghost of an impression left by a previous writer, mirror writing that gradually resolved into legible text. "V. Ainsley," Holmes read aloud, and beneath it, "Linden Court, St. John's Wood." Our mysterious lady caller was considerate enough to leave us her direction, though the torn corner of her card suggests haste and the deep impression speaks of agitation. The hand itself is educated. There is discipline in the formation of letters. The sound of heavy footsteps upon the stair interrupted his observations, and a moment later a portly gentleman appeared in the doorway, his face flushed with exertion and bearing the unmistakable stamp of commercial prosperity. His dark overcoat was expensive but showed signs of hasty donning, and his gloved hands clutched a silk hat with nervous energy. "Inspector Lestrade?" the newcomer inquired, his voice carrying the cultivated tones of a man accustomed to deference. "I am Julius Price, Quinton's business partner. I came as soon as I received word of this dreadful tragedy." Holmes turned from the desk, his keen gaze taking in every detail of Price's appearance. The man was indeed well dressed, though Watson noted a certain dishevelment about his collar, and the way his left glove seemed to bulge slightly, as if concealing something beneath. Price's small bright eyes darted about the room with the calculating assessment of a practised appraiser, lingering upon the desk where his partner had met his mysterious end. "Mr. Price," Holmes began with deceptive casualness, "Mr. Barnes mentioned that you seemed to have mislaid something during your visit yesterday evening. A pocket warmer, I believe." The effect of these words upon Price was immediate and striking. His face paled visibly, and his right hand moved instinctively toward his left glove before checking the gesture with obvious effort. "Yes, indeed. A small device I use for warming my hands during these bitter months, quite indispensable to me as I suffer from poor circulation. I searched thoroughly but could not locate it anywhere." "A German design, was it not?" Holmes continued, his tone remaining conversational while his eyes never left Price's face. "Japanned tin with perforated holes for proper ventilation?" Price nodded with what seemed excessive eagerness. "Precisely so, Mr. Holmes. I acquired it during my travels in Bavaria several years ago. Most ingenious device. One fills it with glowing charcoal, and it provides steady warmth for hours without danger of flame. I had hoped to retrieve it this morning, but under these tragic circumstances, Lestrade consulted his notebook with official thoroughness. We shall need to verify your whereabouts after your departure yesterday evening, Mr. Price. Merely routine procedure, you understand? Of course, Inspector. I proceeded directly home to my lodgings in Bloomsbury. My landlady, Mrs. Pemberton, served me dinner at 7 a.m., and I remained in my rooms for the remainder of the evening, reading. She can vouch for my presence throughout the night. Holmes had moved to the fireplace during this exchange, his attention apparently focused upon the cold ashes, but Watson knew his friend's capacity for absorbing multiple conversations while seeming preoccupied. Now he straightened and approached Price with that peculiar gliding step that often preceded his most penetrating observations. "Tell me, Mr. Price, when you departed yesterday evening, did you encounter anyone approaching the building?" Mr. Barnes mentioned observing a gentleman in the vicinity as he reached the corner. Price's hesitation was barely perceptible, but Watson caught it, as did Holmes, whose grey eyes narrowed with interest. "I may have passed someone in the fog, but I paid little attention. The evening was growing quite thick, and I was anxious to reach home before the weather worsened further." "And your pocket warmer?" Holmes pressed gently. "Was it charged with fuel when you arrived here yesterday?" "I believe it was running rather low," Price admitted, his gloved hands tightening upon his hat brim. "Indeed, that may explain why I felt compelled to search for it so thoroughly. Without adequate warmth, my fingers become quite stiff and painful in this weather." Holmes nodded thoughtfully, then moved toward the desk with renewed purpose. He knelt beside the chair where Quinton had died and rose slowly, the crumpled fragment of perforated tin gleaming dully in his palm. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the distant rumble of traffic and the soft hiss of gas from the street lamps beginning their early illumination against the gathering fog. "Would this, by any chance, be a portion of your missing device, Mr. Price?" Holmes inquired, his voice carrying a note of silk-wrapped steel. Price stared at the twisted metal, his face cycling through expressions of surprise, recognition, and something that might have been fear. In that moment of silence, Watson felt the very air in the room seemed to thicken with unspoken accusations and half-revealed truths. Price's face underwent a transformation that Watson had witnessed countless times in his medical practice, the particular pallor that accompanies the sudden recognition of one's own mortality. His gloved hands trembled as he stared at the twisted fragment in Holmes's palm, and when he spoke, his voice carried the hollow quality of a man whose carefully constructed world had begun to crumble. That does appear to be a portion of my warmer, he admitted, his words barely above a whisper. But I cannot fathom how it came to be in such a state. The device was perfectly intact when I last employed it. His eyes darted between Holmes and Lestrade with the desperate calculation of a cornered animal seeking escape. Holmes turned the fragment slowly, allowing the dim light to catch its perforated surface. Indeed, Mr. Price, the metal has been subjected to extreme temperatures and then rapid cooling, causing this distinctive warping. Such damage suggests the device was employed far beyond its intended capacity. He paused, his grey eyes never leaving Price's face. Your left glove appears to bulge in a curious fashion. Might I suggest you have something concealed beneath it? The effect was immediate and devastating. Price's left hand moved instinctively toward his coat, then froze as he realized the betraying nature of the gesture. With obvious reluctance, he began to remove the glove, revealing what caused Watson to draw a sharp breath of professional concern. Price's palm and fingers bore the unmistakable marks of recent burns, angry red welts and blisters that spoke eloquently of contact with intensely heated metal. The evidence was damning in its clarity, yet when Price spoke, his voice carried a note of desperate sincerity that gave Watson pause. Gentlemen, I can see how this must appear, but I had nothing to do with Quinton's death. His voice broke slightly as he flexed his damaged fingers. I discovered the warmer here this morning before the police arrived. I have my own key, naturally, and I came early to review some papers. When I found Quinton, he shuddered visibly. The shock was tremendous. The warmer was still radiating heat, and in my foolish haste to retrieve it, I grasped it without thinking. Lestrade's pencil scratched urgently across his notebook. You were here before we arrived. That's a significant detail you failed to mention, Mr. Price. I realize how it appears, but there was something else, something so grotesque that I knew immediately this was no natural death. Price's shoulders sagged as if bearing an enormous weight. The warmer had been placed deliberately upon Quinton's hands, positioned so that the heat would maintain their warmth long after death. The site was so calculated, so precisely arranged, that I understood someone had staged the entire scene. Holmes nodded slowly, his keen mind already processing the implications. Now we approach the heart of the matter. Someone wished us to discover a corpse with warm hands, knowing such an anomaly would perplex the authorities and perhaps misdirect our investigation. The sound of heavy footsteps upon the stair interrupted his observations, and a moment later a tall, spare figure appeared in the doorway. The newcomer possessed the unmistakable bearing of a military man, shoulders squared, chin elevated, and eyes that had witnessed both triumph and defeat. His cavalry moustache bristled with barely contained anger, and he carried a Malacca cane fitted with a black silk tassel. I demand to see Quinton, he began, then stopped short, as the room's sombre atmosphere conveyed its own message. Dead? Then Providence has intervened, saving me from complete ruin by removing a blood-sucking usurer from this world. Lestrade was upon him immediately. Your name, sir? Colonel Arthur Fitzjohn, late of the 11th Hussars. And before you ask, yes, I had dealings with that parasite. He held notes against my property that would have reduced my family to beggary. Holmes had drifted toward the newcomer with that peculiar gliding step Watson knew preceded his most penetrating observations. His eyes fell upon the colonel's cane, noting the silk guard knot that looped his wrist, frayed at one end, with a single black filament protruding like an accusatory finger. There was also upon the kid of his right glove a faint brown smear that might have been soot. "You were in the vicinity last night, Colonel?" Holmes inquired with deceptive casualness. "I was at my club until nearly midnight, then walked home through Pall Mall. The rag will vouch for my presence." Fitzjohn's eyes flashed dangerously. "If you're suggesting I had anything to do with this man's death—" "I suggest nothing," Holmes replied serenely. "I merely observed that a tall gentleman of good address was seen approaching this building near 9 o'clock, and that your silk guard appears newly damaged. The keyhole of this room contained a fragment of just such material." The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the distant rumble of traffic and the soft hiss of gas lamps beginning their early illumination against the thickening fog. Watson felt the familiar thrill of a case reaching its crucial juncture, where multiple threads of evidence began to weave together into a comprehensible pattern. Holmes moved to the fireplace and knelt beside the grate, his penknife extracting from the inner angle of the skirting board a minute black flake. He examined it through his magnifying glass before rising with that thin, dangerous smile Watson knew so well. "Ingenious," he murmured, "but not infallible." He turned to address both suspects, his voice carrying the authority of absolute certainty. "Gentlemen, we stand at the threshold of revelation, a pocket-warmer employed to deceive, a door secured with silk thread, and hands kept warm to confound the medical examiner. Yet one element remains, the mysterious Miss Ainslie, whose card bears the address of Linden Court in St. John's Wood." Lestrade looked between Price and Fitzjohn with obvious frustration. "Surely we should detain these men, Mr. Holmes?" "Not yet, Inspector. The web is more complex than it appears, and premature action might allow the true architect of this deception to escape our net." Holmes moved toward the door with renewed purpose. "There is a lady whose name appears too frequently in the margins of this affair. We shall pay our respects to Miss Ainslie and perhaps learn why her visiting card was torn with such violence." As they prepared to depart, Holmes paused at the threshold and cast one final glance around the office where death had been made to masquerade as something other than itself. The fog pressed against the windows like a living thing, and somewhere in its grey depths lay the final pieces of a puzzle that had already claimed one life and threatened to destroy several others. The hansom that bore them through London's fog-shrouded streets moved with the measured pace of a funeral cortege, its wheels finding purchase on cobblestones made treacherous by the moisture-laden air. Holmes sat in contemplative silence, his aquiline profile cutting sharply through the dim interior, while his long fingers performed that familiar steepling gesture Watson had learned to associate with the rapid cataloguing of evidence. The familiar landmarks of the Strand gradually gave way to the more genteel thoroughfares of St. John's Wood, where respectable villas peered through the grey curtain like watchful sentinels guarding their domestic secrets. "The torn card troubles me, Watson," Holmes finally spoke, his voice barely audible above the clip of hooves on stone. "A lady of breeding does not mutilate her own visiting card without compelling reason. Either Miss Ainslie departed Quinton's office in considerable distress, or someone else removed a portion of that card to conceal information we were not meant to discover." Watson shifted in his seat, his medical instincts engaged by the psychological implications. Could she have witnessed something that frightened her? The timing of her visit places her at the scene during the crucial hours. "Precisely my thoughts, my dear fellow. We must approach this interview with particular delicacy. Miss Ainsley may hold the key to our puzzle, yet she may not even realize the significance of what she observed. Linden Court proved to be one of those quiet residential crescents that embodied the restrained prosperity of London's expanding middle class. The fog here was less oppressive, allowing glimpses of well-tended gardens and the warm glow of gas lamps beginning to illuminate drawing-room windows against the gathering dusk. Number 17 stood modestly among its neighbours, a neat villa with ivy climbing its brick facade and brass fittings that gleamed despite the moisture-laden air. The maid who answered their summons possessed the nervous efficiency of a servant in a household where every penny was carefully counted. Her eyes darted between the three men with obvious apprehension as Lestrade presented his credentials, and when she led them into the drawing-room, Watson noted the careful arrangement of modest but tasteful furnishings, watercolour landscapes, a well-maintained pianoforte, and fresh flowers that spoke of a household run with loving attention to detail despite financial constraints. Miss Ainsley, when she appeared, proved to be a woman of perhaps 30 years, with the pale complexion and intelligent eyes Watson associated with the teaching profession. Her dark hair was arranged with meticulous care, and her simple dress, while not expensive, was perfectly maintained. Most significantly, she carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone accustomed to maintaining composure under difficult circumstances. Miss Ainsley, Holmes began with infinite gentleness, "We are investigating the death of Mr. Quinton. We understand you called upon him yesterday evening, and we found your visiting card upon his desk." She inclined her head with calm acknowledgment. "I am governess to Colonel and Mrs. Fitzjohn's children, gentlemen. I visited Mr. Quinton on their behalf. The family faces financial difficulties, and he held notes that threatened their ruin. I hoped a personal appeal might succeed where formal correspondence had failed." Watson felt a surge of understanding. The connection between Miss Ainsley and Colonel Fitzjohn explained the torn card and added another layer to the complex web of relationships surrounding Quinton's death. Holmes, meanwhile, had moved to examine the pianoforte, his keen eyes noting the violin case that lay open beside it. "You are musical, Miss Ainsley," he observed, returning to face her. "I detect the faintest trace of rosin powder upon your glove, evidence of recent practice." A faint smile touched her lips. "Music provides solace during difficult times, Mr. Holmes. I find that Bach's mathematical precision brings order to chaos." Holmes nodded approvingly, then withdrew a sheet of paper and pencil. "Might I trouble you to write your name and address? A matter of comparison with the impression left on Mr. Quinton's blotter." She complied without hesitation, her handwriting revealing the educated precision Watson had expected. As she returned the pencil, Holmes's nostrils dilated almost imperceptibly. That subtle reaction, Watson knew, indicated the detection of some significant scent. "Your interview with Mr. Quinton," Holmes continued, "how did he receive your appeal?" Miss Ainsley's composure flickered slightly. "He was utterly unmoved by the family's circumstances, cold and calculating as always. He made figures upon a scrap of paper as I spoke, some notation I could not decipher, then tore the corner from my card and slipped it into his waistcoat pocket. He promised nothing definite, but suggested he might send word today." "Did you observe anything unusual in his office? Any other visitors or objects that struck your attention?" She considered carefully. "The room was warmer than usual. Mr. Quinton was notoriously parsimonious with coal. I noticed what appeared to be a small metallic device upon his desk near the inkwell. It seemed to emit a faint glow, though I thought little of it at the time." "And Mr. Quinton's demeanour after your conversation?" "He seemed almost pleased with himself. as if anticipating some favorable development. He mentioned expecting another visitor, someone who would help resolve several outstanding matters to his satisfaction. He would not elaborate further. Holmes had been studying her face throughout this recitation, and now he moved to the window where the afternoon light, filtered through fog, cast strange shadows across the room. From his pocket he withdrew the crumpled fragment of perforated tin, holding it where she could see it clearly. "Would this be similar to the device you observed, Miss Ainsley?" Her eyes widened with recognition. "Yes, precisely like it. Though this appears damaged, the one I saw was intact and glowing with contained heat." The sound of footsteps in the hall interrupted their conversation, and the maid reappeared with obvious agitation. "Begging your pardon, miss, but there's been a gentleman calling. He came while you were giving your lesson to Master Frederick this morning. Left this card and said to mention it if the police came asking questions." Holmes took the card with barely concealed eagerness. It bore the printed name of Julius Price, and on the reverse, in hurried script, "If any inquiry is made, say nothing of my visit yesterday. J.P." "Most illuminating," Holmes murmured, pocketing the card with an impassive expression. "Miss Ainsley, you have been admirably frank with us. Should anyone attempt to persuade you to alter your account of yesterday's events, remember that concealment may harm those you seek to protect." As they prepared to depart, Holmes paused at the threshold and cast one final glance around the modest drawing-room. In the street outside, the fog swirled with renewed intensity, and Watson felt the familiar thrill that preceded the convergence of multiple investigative threads. Holmes stopped suddenly beside the front garden gate, stooping to retrieve something from the gutter, a tiny triangular slip of card, moisture-stained but still bearing faint traces of print. "The torn corner," Watson breathed, watching Holmes dry it carefully upon his sleeve. Indeed, and bearing the notation B14, undoubtedly a reference to page 14 of Ledger B, the volume Barnes fetched from the cellar. Holmes's grey eyes gleamed with satisfaction. "Someone carried this from Quinton's office and lost it within 20 paces of Miss Ainsley's door. The question remains whether that someone was friend or foe." As their hansom pulled away from Linden Court, Watson glanced back through the fog and caught sight of a dark figure detaching itself from the shadows near the area railings, watching their departure with obvious interest. Holmes's hand touched his sleeve with knowing pressure. "Yes, Watson, we are being observed, which suggests our investigation has touched upon something more dangerous than a simple case of financial murder. The web grows more complex with each revelation, and I begin to suspect that Mr. Quinton's death was merely the opening gambit in a far more elaborate game." The fog closed around them once more as they returned toward the heart of London, carrying with them new questions that demanded answers and the growing certainty that they were racing against time to prevent another tragedy from unfolding in the grey streets of the great metropolis. The return journey through London's fog-shrouded streets provided Holmes with the contemplative silence he required to synthesize the mounting evidence. Watson observed his friend's characteristic stillness, the aquiline profile motionless against the hansom's leather upholstery, the long fingers pressed together in that familiar steeple, and the grey eyes fixed upon some invisible point where logic and intuition converged. The familiar landmarks of the city had been reduced to mere suggestions in the grey curtain, yet Holmes seemed to navigate by some internal compass that pointed unerringly toward truth. "The torn corner troubles me less now than its intended purpose," Holmes finally spoke, his voice cutting through the muffled sounds of traffic. "Consider the sequence, Watson. Miss Ainsley's card is deliberately mutilated in her presence, yet she states clearly that Quinton pocketed the fragment. How then does it appear in the gutter outside her residence? Someone carried it there, someone who had access to Quinton's office after her departure. Lestrade shifted uncomfortably in his seat. You're suggesting someone else was present during the crucial hours? More than present, Inspector. Someone who remained long enough to search Quinton's effects and make notations of their own. Holmes withdrew the triangular fragment, studying the faint pencil marks through his magnifying glass. This reference to B14 was not made by Quinton's hand. The pressure is different. The angle of the writing suggests haste, and most tellingly, Miss Ainslie observed Quinton making figures on a separate scrap of paper, not upon her card. As their hansom drew near Arundel Street, Holmes rapped twice upon the roof and called softly to the driver. "Circle the block once, if you please. We have been observed since leaving St. John's Wood, and I prefer to understand the nature of our escort before proceeding." Watson felt the familiar thrill of danger as Holmes leaned forward, his keen eyes scanning the fog-wrapped street. Through the grey curtain, a tall figure detached itself from the shadows near a lamp-post, moving with the measured pace of someone accustomed to long watches. Holmes smiled that thin, dangerous smile Watson knew so well. A patient fellow, our shadow, military bearing, expensive overcoat, and the habit of touching his left pocket, checking for something small and precious. When we alight, Watson, observe his reaction to our destination. The constable at number 47 straightened visibly at their approach, his relief evident despite the professional composure he attempted to maintain. "Inspector, sir, there's been a development. About an hour past I heard sounds from below, footsteps in the cellar. When I investigated, I found the door to the ledger room standing ajar, though I'm certain it was secured when we left." Holmes's eyes narrowed with interest. "Show us at once." The descent to the cellar revealed the methodical thoroughness of their unknown visitor. The ledger room door bore fresh scratches around the lock, and upon the stone floor Holmes's magnifying glass revealed the telltale impressions of expensive boots, the same crescent-shaped nick from a spur counter that they had observed upstairs. "Our military gentleman has been busy," Holmes murmured, examining the shelves where the bound volumes stood, in their alphabetical ranks. "Ledger B, here is the gap where it should rest. Removed entirely, not merely consulted." He knelt beside the reading table, where scattered fragments of paper told their own story. Torn pages, hastily destroyed, but observe this, Watson, the binding threads remain, suggesting page 14 was removed with particular care. From beneath the table, his keen eyes detected something that made him pause. With infinite delicacy, he extracted a small, triangular piece of pasteboard, the missing corner of Miss Ainslie's visiting card, bearing the notation B14 in pencil. "Our visitor was careless in his haste," Holmes observed with satisfaction. He consulted this notation to locate the correct page, then discarded the evidence. But what could page 14 contain that warranted such desperate measures? Lestrade examined the fragment with growing excitement. "Shall we question Fitzjohn immediately, Mr. Holmes? The evidence seems clear enough." "Clear, yes, but incomplete," Holmes replied, rising with that fluid grace Watson had observed countless times. "We must understand what drove our colonel to such desperate measures before we reveal our hand. The warm hands that began this mystery were merely the opening gambit in a far more complex game." As they ascended from the cellar, Holmes paused at the main office door, his nostrils dilating with that subtle reaction Watson recognized as the detection of some significant scent. Upon the brass handle, barely visible, was a faint smear of what appeared to be glove dressing, the glycerine and borax preparation favored by gentlemen who valued immaculate appearance. Our colonel maintains his standards even during clandestine activities, Holmes observed with dry amusement. But I suspect his next move will be less subtle. A man who tears pages from ledgers in desperation is a man approaching the limits of rational behavior. The fog pressed against the windows with renewed intensity as they prepared to depart, and somewhere in its grey depths, Watson sensed, moved forces that had transformed a simple case of financial murder into something far more dangerous. The game was indeed afoot, but the rules had changed and the stakes were rising with each passing hour. Holmes stood motionless for a moment at the threshold, his keen mind already racing ahead to the next phase of their investigation. "We shall return to Baker Street, gentlemen. There are preparations to make, and I suspect our colonel will provide us with another opportunity to observe his methods before this night is through. The hunter, as they say, may yet become the hunted." The familiar gaslight of Baker Street provided welcome sanctuary from the fog-wrapped uncertainties that had pursued them through London's grey arteries. Holmes moved with that characteristic energy Watson recognized as the herald of revelation, his long frame animated by the restless vitality that accompanied the convergence of multiple investigative threads. He positioned himself before the hearth, his aquiline profile sharp against the dancing flames, while his keen mind processed the mounting evidence with mathematical precision. "The threads converge, Watson, but not as Scotland Yard would have us believe," Holmes announced, his grey eyes gleaming with that inner fire that accompanied his most penetrating insights. "Consider the psychology of our players. Fitzjohn possesses the desperate courage of a military man facing disgrace, yet the warm hands speak of someone with anatomical knowledge and a taste for theatrical misdirection. These are not the methods of a cavalry officer driven to murder by financial ruin." Lestrade shifted uncomfortably in his chair, consulting his notebook with official thoroughness. "The evidence against the colonel seems compelling, Mr. Holmes. The silk thread, his presence in the cellar, the torn ledger page. All true, Inspector, but consider the sequence. Fitzjohn's desperate search for page 14 suggests he sought to conceal evidence, not create it. A man who kills to protect his secrets does not then return to destroy documentary proof of his motive." Holmes paused, his long fingers steepling in that familiar gesture. "No, our colonel is guilty of something, but perhaps not of murder. The warm hands were designed to perplex the medical examiner and delay our investigation, providing time for the true perpetrator to complete their scheme." Watson leaned forward, his medical training compelling him to examine the psychological implications. "Then you believe someone else orchestrated Quinton's death and arranged the evidence to implicate Fitzjohn?" "Precisely, my dear fellow. Price's burned hand and missing pocket warmer connect him to the theatrical staging, while Fitzjohn's separate activities in the cellar reveal a man desperately attempting to erase evidence of some deeper secret. They are not confederates, but competitors, each pursuing their own agenda in the aftermath of Quinton's death." The sound of rapid footsteps upon the stair interrupted Holmes's discourse, and a moment later Mrs. Hudson appeared with obvious agitation. Behind her pressed a young man whose dishevelled appearance and wild eyes spoke eloquently of recent terror. "Begging your pardon, Mr. Holmes," Mrs. Hudson began breathlessly, "but this gentleman insists it's a matter of life and death." The newcomer pushed forward with desperate urgency. "Mr. Holmes, I am Frederick Barnes, brother to the clerk who discovered Mr. Quinton's body. My brother has disappeared, and I fear he may have met with foul play." Holmes gestured toward the vacant chair with immediate attention, his entire demeanor shifting to accommodate this new development. "Pray be seated, Mr. Barnes, and tell us everything in proper sequence. When did you last see your brother?" "This morning, after he spoke with you gentlemen at the office. He returned home greatly agitated, muttering about ledgers and missing pages. He said he remembered something important, something he had forgotten to mention about who he had seen in the building. He departed again near 3 o'clock, saying he must return to Arundel Street to verify his suspicions. The young man's voice broke with emotion. When darkness fell without word, I searched everywhere, the office, the nearby streets, even the morgue. The constable said no one had approached the building since your departure. Holmes had moved to the window during this recitation, his keen eyes scanning the fog-wrapped street below. Your brother mentioned seeing someone who should not have been there. Did he elaborate upon this recollection? Only that he recognized someone but did not expect to encounter them in that place. He seemed torn between fear and duty, afraid to speak yet compelled by conscience. Watson felt a chill of apprehension as the implications became clear. Young Barnes had stumbled upon evidence that could expose the true architect of this elaborate deception, and now he had vanished into London's grey maze. Holmes turned from the window with that expression of grim satisfaction Watson had learned to associate with the final phases of his most complex cases. The game grows more dangerous, gentlemen. Our adversary has been forced to act precipitously, removing Barnes before he could share his knowledge. But in doing so, they have revealed the depth of their desperation. He moved to his desk and began composing telegrams with rapid efficiency. We shall set a trap that our quarry cannot resist. They believe they have silenced the one witness who could expose them, but they cannot be certain how much Barnes has already revealed. They will be watching us, waiting to gauge our next move. The fog pressed against the windows with renewed intensity, and somewhere in its grey depths moved forces that had already claimed one life and now threatened another. Holmes's thin smile carried the promise of justice, finally within reach. Prepare yourself, Watson. Before this night is through, we shall force our adversary into the light, and young Barnes shall be restored to his brother's anxious care. Holmes's telegrams were dispatched with the precision of a field marshal coordinating a complex campaign, each message calculated to force their adversary into revealing their hand. The first went to Inspector Bradstreet at Scotland Yard, requesting immediate but discreet surveillance of Price's Bloomsbury lodgings. The second, more cryptically worded, was directed to the foreman of the Adelphi Arches, requesting access to the bonded warehouses under official authority. The third bore the address of young Barnes's lodgings in Bermondsey. "The trap is set, Watson," Holmes announced, settling into his chair with that characteristic stillness that preceded his most audacious gambits. "Our quarry believes young Barnes has been silenced, but they cannot be certain what intelligence he may have documented before his disappearance. A methodical man like Barnes would have kept records, and those records may provide both the key to his rescue and the final evidence we require." Frederick Barnes had accepted Holmes's offer of sanctuary with obvious relief, though his anxiety for his brother's welfare remained painfully evident. When Holmes inquired about Edward's habits and possible hiding places, the young man's response proved illuminating. "Edward was always methodical, Mr. Holmes. He kept detailed records of everything, his daily observations, conversations that struck him as significant, even his suspicions about irregularities at the office. If he suspected danger, he would document his concerns before taking any action. He maintains a locked drawer at our lodgings where he stores his private papers." Holmes's eyes sharpened with interest. "These records, we must examine them immediately. They may contain the very evidence that cost your brother his freedom." The journey to Bermondsey carried them through increasingly humble neighbourhoods, where the fog seemed to press more closely against the narrow streets and the gaslight grew more intermittent. Their destination proved to be a respectable boarding house, its brick facade blackened by decades of London soot, but maintained with obvious care. The landlady, Mrs. Whitmore, received them with the suspicious courtesy reserved for unexpected visitors, though her manner softened considerably when Frederick explained the circumstances. Edward Barnes's room reflected the orderly mind Holmes had described, books arranged by subject, clothes hung with military precision, and a small writing desk positioned to catch the maximum light from the single window. The locked drawer yielded to Holmes's delicate ministrations, revealing a collection of notebooks bound with red tape and labelled by date. Holmes selected the most recent volume and began reading with intense concentration, his grey eyes moving rapidly across the closely written pages. Watson observed his friend's expression change from professional interest to growing excitement, finally settling into that grim satisfaction that accompanied the discovery of crucial evidence. "Remarkable," Holmes murmured, passing the notebook to Watson. Young Barnes possessed powers of observation that would have served Scotland Yard admirably. "Read the entry for yesterday evening." Watson found the relevant passage and read aloud. "Observed Mr. Julius Price entering building via rear entrance at approximately 9:15, though he claimed to have departed at 6 Youst. Remained nearly 2 hours. Upon leaving appeared to carry something wrapped in cloth, possibly ledger volume. Most significantly noticed fresh scratches around cellar door, lock this morning suggesting unauthorized access to records." Holmes nodded with satisfaction, then turned to earlier entries. "Here, 3 weeks past. Noticed Mr. Price's signature varies significantly when he believes himself unobserved. Compared samples suggest possible forgery or assumed identity. The partnership credentials may be fraudulent. Must investigate further without arousing suspicion." The implications struck Watson with sudden clarity. Price is not who he claims to be. The partnership with Quinton was based on false credentials, and page 14 of Ledger B contained evidence that would expose his deception. Holmes closed the notebook with decisive finality. "More than expose, Watson, consider the psychology. A man who assumes another's identity in a financial partnership has access to considerable sums. Quinton's death was not motivated by personal animosity, but by the desperate need to silence the one person who could destroy Price's carefully constructed facade." The sound of footsteps upon the stair interrupted their conference, and Mrs. Whitmore appeared with obvious agitation. "Begging your pardon, gentlemen, but there's a man below asking questions about Edward. Claims to be investigating his disappearance, but his manner seems unsettling." Holmes moved to the window with cat-like swiftness, peering down into the fog-wrapped street below. A tall figure stood beneath the gaslight, his expensive overcoat and bandaged left hand unmistakable despite the dim illumination. "Mr. Price has come calling," Holmes observed with that thin, dangerous smile Watson knew so well. "He seeks to learn what young Barnes may have recorded about his activities, but his very presence here confirms our deductions. He is indeed monitoring our investigation, desperate to assess the extent of our knowledge." Holmes withdrew a small brass key from his waistcoat and pressed it into Frederick's palm. "Should anything prevent our return, this opens a safety deposit box at Coutts Bank. Inside you will find complete documentation of our investigation. Now we must move quickly. Price's presence suggests Barnes is being held somewhere nearby, and we have little time before desperation drives our adversary to more extreme measures." The fog swirled around the building like a living thing, and Watson felt the familiar thrill that preceded the final phase of Holmes's most complex cases. The hunter had indeed become the hunted, but the game was far from over. Somewhere in London's grey maze, young Barnes awaited rescue, while his meticulous records had provided the key to unravelling one of the most elaborate deceptions Holmes had ever encountered. "Come, Watson," Holmes murmured, gathering his coat and checking his revolver. The endgame approaches, and we must ensure that justice, not villainy, emerges triumphant from this fog-shrouded night. Holmes moved to the window. With that characteristic economy of motion Watson had observed countless times, his keen eyes scanning the fog-wrapped street below, where Price maintained his vigil beneath the gaslight. The man's nervous energy was palpable even at distance. The repeated checking of his pocket watch, the restless pacing, the way his bandaged hand moved instinctively toward his coat pocket suggested a rendezvous or signal expected within the hour. "He awaits word from an accomplice," Holmes murmured, his voice barely audible. "Observe his behavior, Watson. This is not a man conducting casual surveillance, but one whose carefully orchestrated plan has reached a crucial juncture. Young Barnes is being held somewhere nearby, and Price's agitation suggests the location may be compromised." Holmes turned to Frederick Barnes with that expression of quiet authority Watson knew so well. "You will remain here with Mrs. Whitmore. Should we not return within 2 hours, proceed directly to Scotland Yard with the notebooks and that key. Tell Inspector Lestrade everything." He withdrew his revolver and checked the chambers with practiced efficiency. "We shall use Price's own surveillance against him." The descent to street level required the utmost caution, for Holmes intended to reverse the game entirely. Through the boarding house's rear entrance, they slipped into the maze of alleys that honeycombed this quarter of London, emerging 2 streets distant, where Holmes's whistle summoned their reliable cabman from the fog like a conjured spirit. "Drive toward Piccadilly," Holmes instructed quietly. "Then circle back through Villiers Street to the Embankment. Take the turns wide and obvious. We want our shadow to gain confidence in his pursuit." The strategy proved immediately effective. Within moments, a second hansom emerged from the grey curtain, maintaining what its occupant doubtless believed to be discreet distance. Holmes watched through the cab's rear window with satisfaction as Price's vehicle followed their deliberate route toward the Thames. "The Adelphi Arches, Watson," Holmes explained as their destination became clear. Quinton's sobriquet of the Quays was no mere affectation. He maintained storage facilities beneath the Strand, and I suspect Price has appropriated them for his current purposes. The glycerine and borax we detected earlier, combined with the faint trace of Baltic resins, these point unmistakably to the bonded warehouses where such materials are legitimately stored. The Arches received them with their characteristic sepulchral atmosphere, that perpetual twilight beneath the great buildings where the Thames pressed its unseen weight against ancient brick and mortar. The foreman who met them at the wicket gate recognized Holmes's official authority immediately, leading them through vaulted corridors where numbered arches stretched into the darkness like the ribs of some vast sleeping beast. Holmes paused at Arch 6, his nostrils dilating with that subtle reaction Watson had learned to recognize. "Fresh traces of our quarry," he observed, examining the lock mechanism. "But listen, Watson, do you detect that sound?" Through the heavy air came a faint but persistent pattern of tapping. 3 short, 2 long, repeated at regular intervals. Holmes's eyes sharpened with recognition and admiration. "Morse code," he breathed. "Young Barnes demonstrates remarkable resourcefulness even in captivity. He signals not merely his presence but his location within the storage area." Holmes produced his lock-picking tools and set to work with delicate precision. "The direct approach, my dear fellow. Price believes himself secure in his fortress, but he has underestimated both our determination and Barnes's ingenuity." The lock yielded with barely audible clicks, and they slipped inside to find themselves among towering stacks of crates and barrels. The tapping grew more distinct as they navigated the maze, leading them toward a pool of lamplight in the arch's depths. Holmes moved with cat-like silence, his hand ready upon his revolver as voices became audible through the commercial debris. The clerk's notebook contained everything, Price was saying, his voice carrying the strained quality of a man whose world was collapsing. Detailed observations about signature variations, suspicions about the partnership documents, even notes about my unauthorized access to the ledgers. If Holmes has seen those records— "Then we finish this and disappear," interrupted a rougher voice with the accent of London's docklands. "The morning tide serves our purposes well enough. One more body in the Thames raises no questions, and we'll be bound for Hamburg with funds sufficient for a new life entirely." Through a gap between crates they could observe the scene, Price standing beside a chair where young Barnes sat bound but alert, his eyes bright with intelligence despite his predicament. A burly accomplice in dockworker's clothing held a wicked knife with casual familiarity, while the oil lamp cast dancing shadows across their faces. The tapping had ceased, suggesting Barnes had detected their approach. Holmes withdrew the crumpled fragment of perforated tin from his pocket, holding it where the lamplight would catch its surface, then spoke in a voice calculated to carry just far enough. "The evidence is conclusive, Watson. Page 14 of Ledger B, the forged partnership documents, even the pocket warmer used to maintain the corpse's deceptive warmth, all point to our impostor's elaborate scheme." The effect was immediate and dramatic. Price spun toward their concealment, his eyes wide with desperate calculation, while his accomplice raised the knife with professional readiness. In that moment of distraction, Holmes moved, not forward in direct assault, but laterally, drawing their attention, while Watson circled from the opposite direction. "You will surrender that evidence, Mr. Holmes," Price called, his voice hollow with defeat, yet edged with dangerous determination, "or I swear this night will see more than one death upon these stones." "Your threats carry little weight," Holmes replied calmly, stepping into the lamplight with his revolver trained steadily upon the impostor. "A man who steals identities as readily as he manipulates ledgers has already revealed the poverty of his character. The game is concluded, Mr. Price, or should I say, whatever your true name might be." The dock worker lunged toward Barnes with his blade raised, but Watson's service revolver spoke with authoritative finality. The man crumpled with a cry of pain, his weapon clattering across the stone floor. In the same instant, Lestrade and two constables emerged from the shadows where Holmes's earlier telegram had positioned them, surrounding the conspirators with professional efficiency. Price stared about him with the expression of a man watching his carefully constructed world dissolve into chaos. Even as the handcuffs clicked about his wrists, he maintained that peculiar dignity of the defeated gambler. "You possess nothing concrete," he said, with hollow bravado. "Without the original page, without proof of my true identity—" "On the contrary," Holmes interrupted, helping young Barnes to his feet with gentle care. "We have a clerk's meticulous records taken in conscience and preserved against just such necessity. We have Miss Ainsley's testimony regarding your message of suppression. We have your own burned hand and the fragments of your pocket warmer. Most significantly, we have you, and Scotland Yard possesses methods for determining true identity that may surprise you." As Barnes flexed his freed limbs and accepted Watson's medical attention for his bonds chafing, Holmes surveyed the scene with that expression of quiet satisfaction Watson had learned to associate with justice finally served. The fog pressed against the arch's entrance like a living thing, but within their circle of lamplight, truth had at last emerged victorious over deception. "The night's work approaches completion, Watson," Holmes observed, his grey eyes reflecting the oil flames' dance. "Yet mysteries remain, the true identity of our impostor, the fate of the real Julius Price, and the full extent of Quinton's financial machinations. Dawn will bring revelations that may surprise us all." The pale light of dawn filtered through the familiar windows of Baker Street dispelling the last vestiges of fog that had shrouded London through the long night of revelation. Holmes sat before the cheerful fire in his mouse-coloured dressing gown, the morning papers scattered about him, while Watson occupied his customary chair with that expression of anticipatory satisfaction that accompanied the denouement of their most intricate cases. Young Barnes, restored to his brother's grateful care and bearing only minor injuries from his ordeal, provided the final testimonial that would see justice properly served. The impostor's true identity proved less mysterious than his methods. Holmes began, his grey eyes reflecting the dancing flames with that peculiar intensity Watson had learned to associate with complete intellectual satisfaction. Our cables from Hamburg have confirmed what young Barnes's meticulous observations first suggested. The man calling himself Julius Price is one Heinrich Brenner, formerly a clerk in the banking house of Rothstein and Company, who fled Germany following the discovery of an elaborate embezzlement scheme. The real Julius Price died of consumption in a Bavarian sanatorium 18 months ago, his death conveniently overlooked by authorities who assumed him to be travelling abroad. Watson leaned forward with professional interest, his medical training compelling him to examine the psychological implications. But surely Quinton would have detected such an elaborate deception during their extended partnership. Holmes's thin smile carried that note of grim satisfaction Watson had learned to treasure. But that assumes Quinton was an innocent victim rather than a willing accomplice in profitable criminality. The truth, my dear fellow, reveals a far more complex web of mutual exploitation. Quinton discovered Brenner's true identity within 6 months of their association, but rather than expose the fraud, he chose to exploit it for his own advantage. Page 14 of Ledger B contained not merely evidence of forged partnership documents, but detailed records of their joint enterprises, usury at rates that would have scandalized even the most rapacious moneylenders, systematic manipulation of property deeds, and the calculated plundering of estates held in trust. The revelation struck Watson with sudden understanding. Quinton was blackmailing his own partner while profiting from their criminal collaboration. Precisely so. The arrangement served both men's purposes until Quinton's avarice overcame his prudence. He had grown weary of sharing profits with a man whose very existence depended upon his continued silence. Holmes rose and moved to the window, his aquiline profile sharp against the morning light. The interview with Miss Ainsley regarding the Fitzjohn family's debts provided the catalyst for Quinton's final gambit. He saw an opportunity to demand not merely money but the complete financial destruction of a respectable family as the price of his continued discretion regarding Brenner's true identity. Holmes paused, his keen mind organizing the final threads of evidence with mathematical precision. Brenner faced an impossible choice. Exposure would mean not only imprisonment, but the revelation of crimes that would see him transported or hanged. He chose murder, but his theatrical nature demanded an elaborate staging that would confound the authorities and provide time for his escape to the continent with the accumulated profits of their partnership. The sound of footsteps upon the stair announced Lestrade's arrival, and the inspector entered with that expression of professional satisfaction Watson had learned to associate with successful conclusions to their joint endeavours. His notebook bulged with statements and evidence that would satisfy the most demanding prosecutor. "Brenner has confessed to everything, Mr. Holmes," Lestrade announced with obvious pleasure. Faced with young Barnes's detailed observations and the mountain of evidence you assembled, he abandoned all pretense. The method was ingenious, I'll grant him that, diabolically so. Holmes nodded with quiet satisfaction. The murder itself was accomplished through a combination of chemistry and patience that would have impressed Professor Moriarty himself. Brenner returned to the office near 10 o'clock. using his own key to gain entry through the rear door, as Barnes observed. He found Quinton alone and unsuspecting, perhaps even pleased at the prospect of concluding their final negotiation. Brenner had prepared his apparatus with meticulous care, the pocket warmer charged with glowing charcoal, a small perforated capsule containing prussic acid crystals, and a quantity of sulfuric acid in a glass phial. Watson felt a chill of professional horror as the implications became clear. Hydrocyanic gas, one of the most rapid and subtle poisons known to medical science. Indeed, my dear fellow, Brenner placed the charged warmer beneath Quinton's desk, positioned the acid crystals in their perforated container atop the heat source, and applied a few drops of the sulfuric acid to initiate the reaction. As the temperature rose, the acid freed the prussic gas, which, being lighter than air, rose directly into Quinton's face as he sat at his desk. Death would have been nearly instantaneous, leaving no trace save a slight darkening of the complexion and the characteristic bitter almond scent that dissipated quickly in the well-ventilated room. Holmes moved to demonstrate the positioning, his long hands sketching the fatal arrangement with scientific precision. The brown stain we observed resulted from the acid's contact with the desk's varnished surface, while the warped metal fragment was all that remained of the capsule after the intense heat destroyed its structural integrity. Brenner returned before dawn to remove the evidence, but the damaged tin had crumbled, leaving the fragment that first directed our suspicions toward the pocket warmer's true purpose. Lestrade consulted his notes with growing admiration. And the warm hands that so puzzled Dr. Manley? The final theatrical flourish in Brenner's elaborate performance, Holmes replied with dry amusement. Having removed the chemical apparatus, he simply placed the still glowing pocket warmer directly upon Quinton's wrists beneath his shirt cuffs. The device continued to radiate heat for hours, maintaining the illusion of recent death long after the body had begun to cool. It was this deception that threw off Dr. Manley's estimate of the time of death and provided Brenner with the alibi he required. Watson shook his head in amazement at the elaborate nature of the scheme. And the locked room mystery? Child's play for a man of Brenner's mechanical aptitude. The silk thread we recovered from the keyhole was drawn around the bolt tongue within, threaded through the keyhole, and secured from the corridor. A sharp tug would withdraw the thread entirely, leaving no trace of external manipulation. The fragment caught in the escutcheon was torn during this process, evidence of haste rather than design. Holmes turned to address the resolution of their supporting characters with that attention to detail Watson had learned to expect. Colonel Fitzjohn's role in this affair was entirely separate from the murder itself. His desperate search of the cellar was motivated by the hope of destroying evidence of debts that would have reduced his family to penury. His fundamental decency prevented him from considering more permanent solutions to his financial difficulties, though his military training served him well in gaining clandestine access to the building. "And Miss Ainsley?" Watson inquired, remembering the governess's quiet dignity under questioning. "Remains entirely innocent of any wrongdoing. Her torn visiting card was appropriated by Quinton as potential evidence in his blackmail scheme, then carried away by Brenner during his frantic search of the office. The fragment we discovered near her residence was lost during Brenner's attempt to intimidate her into silence, an effort that failed due to her natural courage and integrity." Lestrade gathered his papers with obvious satisfaction. "The German authorities are most eager to interview Herr Brenner regarding his previous activities. His accomplice, Marsh, will recover from Dr. Watson's excellent marksmanship and face charges of kidnapping and conspiracy to commit murder." As the inspector departed with his prisoner's confession and the accumulated evidence of their investigation, Holmes settled back into his chair with that expression of philosophical reflection Watson had learned to treasure. The morning sun climbed higher over London's rooftops, burning away the last traces of fog and revealing the great city in all its complex vitality. "Another puzzle solved, Watson," Holmes murmured, taking up his violin and drawing from it a phrase of such crystalline purity that it seemed to cleanse the very air of their sitting room. The warm hands that began our investigation proved to be the coldest calculation of all, a dead man's flesh made to simulate life in service of the living's deception. It is a fitting metaphor for the entire affair, where nothing was as it appeared, and every truth lay hidden beneath layers of theatrical misdirection. Watson smiled and reached for his pen, knowing that somewhere in London's vast maze new mysteries were already taking shape, waiting for the keen mind and restless energy of the world's first consulting detective to illuminate their shadows. The case of the corpse with warm hands had yielded its secrets, but the great game continued, eternal and endlessly fascinating in its human complexity. "Come, Watson," Holmes said, setting aside his violin as Mrs. Hudson's footsteps announced the arrival of breakfast. "I have a telegram from a gentleman in Surrey whose prize roses have begun singing opera at midnight. There is work for us in it, I fancy, though I trust the flora will prove less homicidal than our recent acquaintances, however melodious their voices may be." The familiar laughter that filled their sitting room carried with it the promise of new adventures, new puzzles to solve, and new truths to uncover in the endless complexity of human nature that provided the raw material for their extraordinary partnership.